Welcome to the Tales of the Sun and the Moon, a fictional podcast from the world of New-Camelot. New-Camelot is the setting of the new, character-driven, high fantasy epic, the Sun and Moon Saga. If you enjoy today's story, click the link in the show notes to order your copy of the Sun and Moon Saga's first book, Aurora and Lunar. And now, on with the story. You can follow along in your book with me if you like. And when you hear the sound, turn the page. The Fisherman, the Mermaid, and the Witch by Melody Daniel Luna. Content warning. Includes mentions of sex, domestic violence, and alcoholism. For my father, who showed me early on that becoming a published author was possible, and who told me nautical tales about Princess Desi. And for all of us who grew up longing for our own Merfolkian tale. Part 1. The Fisherman. 'Twas a radiant summer's day, perfect for fishing on the West Coast Sea. Jeremy had rowed his little forest green boat all the way out of the Greenlandian Bay and into the Big Blue. He was alone, and he preferred it that way. Audrey didn't care how he went about his business, so long as he brought her back a catch. And so long as he met her in secret to satisfy her other appetite as well. Truth be told, Jeremy didn't know if their meetings really were a secret. He suspected that His Majesty King James did know, but didn't care. Or at least didn't care enough to actually do anything about it. Perhaps King James was too busy keeping his unruly daughter in line. Come the full harvest moon, she would be 7 solar cycles of age, and with each trip around the sun, Princess Aurora seemed to grow more and more unhinged. So perhaps King James was too busy dealing with Princess Aurora. Or perhaps he was too busy satisfying himself with elven mistresses in the Solar Kingdom. Or perhaps both. Rumor had spread that little Aurora Green wasn't really Audrey's child after all, that she was some half-elven bastard. Jeremy's older brother, Raymond, who lived in the Solar Kingdom, often gossiped about King James, King Reynard, and even Emperor Sola in his booze-infused letters to Jeremy. Regardless, King James was busy, and Audrey was lonely, and she had quite the appetite for Sir Jeremy's fish. No, Jeremy was not a mundane fisherman like the others. Being Sir Jeremy, he was a noble mage, and was therefore allowed to use magic to make his catch. Today the sky was a crystal clear blue, not a cloud in it. The salty breeze dancing across the water was refreshing. What a lovely respite from the castle that Jeremy despised so. He could understand why Princess Aurora was always running off into the woods, although he would certainly never breathe those words to Audrey. Jeremy was very grateful that Audrey had recognized his talent as a fisherman, and that she hadn't forced him to become a castle guard, or a knight, or a quester. Those were the kinds of careers most mages dreamed of, careers in which a noble mage must use their magic for the betterment of the kingdom and the empire. Jeremy, however, had dreamed of spending his days at sea. Still, the funny thing about a dream is this: mere moments after said dream comes true, one typically begins dreaming up the next dream. Jeremy looked up at the waxing crescent moon that was rising in the west over the sea. It was barely visible in the morning sky. He made a wish. Then he returned to his fishing. About an hour passed. All the while, Jeremy just stared at his float. Not a bite. Yes, Jeremy could use magic to catch the fish, but he had never done it that way. He wasn't exactly confident in his magical abilities. The first half of his education had taken place in New-Camelot, back when they had all been studying the craft illegally. They studied magic not so much because they wanted to live life as a warlock or a witch, or so they had been called back on planet Earth, but because if they didn't learn to use their magic, magic would use them. Jeremy hadn't enjoyed his nightly lessons with Professor Schuyler. Still, the alternative was worse. Unlike his older brother Raymond, he had only attended lessons to learn the ways of the craft just well enough to control his magic. Otherwise, it might have accidentally slipped out of him in public, and he would have been put on warlock trial. The second half of his magical education had occurred after the quest for New-Camelot in the New World. Back on planet Earth, it had been perfectly acceptable for a young warlock like Jeremy to feel so dispassionate about his craft. But the entire point of journeying across galaxies and finding this new planet was so that the folk, who had once been called witches and warlocks, could practice magic liberally. 11 solar cycles had passed since they settled here on Utopus, and by, Jeremy had become quite the misfit. Everyone, Raymond, Audrey, King James, King Reynard, Emperor Sola, had implored him to focus on magic, the very thing they had traveled such a long way for. Despite their advice, however, Jeremy had put significantly less effort into his craft since coming to the New World. Catching fish the mundane way was better. Even though it took longer, it was relaxing. Simply put, Jeremy loved being out on the water, and his mundane efforts only made it all the more satisfying when he eventually did bring the fruits of his labor to Audrey. Of course, the fish were for all the Greens: King James, Queen Audrey, Princess Aurora, and Prince Jonathan. However, in his heart, they were all for Audrey. Jeremy would do anything for Audrey, for not only was the Greenlandian queen the fairest maiden he had ever laid eyes on, but she was also a passionate lover, and she had allowed him to dedicate his life not to the solar allegiance, but to the sea. Still, Jeremy hadn't fooled himself into thinking that Audrey actually loved him, or at least he knew that they would never be together. She was the queen. Furthermore, she was about 10 suns older than Jeremy, who had only lived through roughly 20 solar cycles himself. It would never become anything real. This, Jeremy understood. He had accepted this bitter truth while still allowing himself to enjoy his time with Audrey nonetheless. Where are all the fish? Jeremy wondered as he stared at the waves. Have I overfished these waters by the castle? He rowed north, toward the Greenlandian Isles. It took him a couple of hours to get there. It wasn't as though he had never ventured out this way before, but that he had never needed to, and had always done so out of his desire to explore the sea and all her waters. Jeremy sent out his line again, and he waited. The waves crashed against the sides of his boat, ebbing and flowing. The cries of seagulls soared and echoed in the distance. On a day like today, he really didn't mind waiting. He appreciated how his mundane method forced him to sit on the water and take in this serenity. The Greens, however, did not share this sentiment, and so, for the sake of the Greenlandian queen, he prayed he did catch something. Another hour passed. Jeremy was beginning to wonder if, for the first time in his life, he ought to use a summoning spell to lure the fish in. But then something happened, not a tug on his line, but a sound. A voice. No, not one voice. A whole choir of voices. Beautiful voices. Beautiful female voices. Oh, sailor, come listen to our song. Let our voices guide you. We promise the journey won't take long. Now, Audrey had warned him about the mermaids who sang so sweetly, drawing men further and further away from the shore and further out to sea, leading them directly into the choppy waters of a storm, all the while laughing at their demise. But despite his many hours spent at sea, Jeremy had never seen any merfolk. Sometimes, however, he had wondered if he had heard them. For he had heard songs like this before, although they had always been distant, as though the choir was singing to some other sailor, and not to him. But now the voices were louder, and it was as though they were singing to him directly, asking him to follow them, inviting him further out to sea. The sea he loved so much, more than Audrey, in fact. Set out to sea, into the big blue, down, 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 a siren song will carry you. Jeremy followed the song. He allowed it to lead him out past Green Island, the largest of the Greenlandian Isles. This was much further than he had ever traveled in his rowboat, although he had been out even further on Ariana. It was odd how the Greens had named their best ship after Audrey's late mother, a family member that they otherwise never spoke of. Audrey's estrangement from her mother could be accredited to King James's influence, of course. When Jeremy came around the backside of Green Island, no mermaids revealed themselves. Jeremy had been so certain that if he rowed through the choppy waters all the way behind the big, forested island, a whole choir of sirens would be there waiting for him. That was where it had sounded like the singing had been coming from. But now the voices had ceased, and Jeremy was crashing back down to reality. The most pressing thing was this: he was too far out to be in a rowboat anyway. In these waters, you were safe in between the Greenlandian Isles, but once out past them, you were at the mercy of the sea herself. It was only now dawning on Jeremy that this had been the intention of the singers. It must have been a siren song, just as Audrey had warned him. Of course, in his mind, he had suspected this from the beginning. But he had been under their siren song spell and had been acting from his heart. Only now that the spell was lifted, was he able to think clearly again. The entire journey back to the Greenlands, Jeremy felt a fool. Once he was safely back on the shore, however, his feelings started to shift. He might never hear those beautiful voices again, nor would he ever see their faces, which surely were just as beautiful. By the time he made it to Greentown, The voices had possessed him all over again. Even though he could not hear them, they sang in his head. He hummed their song as he waltzed into the Greenlandian castle. He made his way into the throne room, completely unworried about the fact that he had no fish for Audrey. Normally, this would have troubled Jeremy. He had always managed to bring the Greens something. What would they think of him coming empty-handed? However, Jeremy's only concern was the siren's song. But when Jeremy saw Audrey perched on her throne, her long golden blonde hair served as a reminder of his affection for her, and a pang of guilt coursed through him. Upon seeing Jeremy there before her, no fish in hand, Audrey raised an eyebrow. Her bright blue eyes fixed themselves on Jeremy, like a mountain lion stalking its prey. When she asked Jeremy where her fish was, he answered honestly, "Your Majesty, I was out rowing in the northern Greenlandian waters. It was a mundane day like all the rest. And then I heard them." Jeremy had sounded too enthusiastic when he said this last bit, for Audrey raised her eyebrow even higher as she echoed, "Them?" The fisherman could not help himself from raving about the voices. Again, he was under their spell. "The most beautiful singing I've ever heard. Hauntingly beautiful. A choir of water nymphs," Audrey finished, nostrils flaring. "What you heard was a siren's song." Once again, reality came hard and heavy, like the morning after a night of drinking. Now Jeremy understood why Raymond kept returning to the tavern. "Sir Jeremy," the Greenlandian queen continued, in her fraudulent, high-pitched, airy voice, "you were being led to your death. I hope you know that." Audrey was digging the knife in. Of course, in hindsight, it was obvious that this was the truth of the matter. Still, Jeremy didn't want to believe it. On the larger throne beside that of the Greenlandian queen was the Greenlandian king, and he was looking just as concerned as his queen, albeit for different reasons. "Audrey," King James said, "if the sirens have come for Sir Jeremy, should we not use this as an opportunity to catch one?" Audrey shot her king an icy glare. "We've been wanting to catch one for a while now, to preserve it and mount it at the bow of Ariana. But, unlike the land-dwelling elves, these undersea nymphs are impossible to get your hands on. So if they have called out to Sir Jeremy, then let us use this to our advantage." Even though Jeremy was a fisherman, the thought of fishing a mermaid horrified him. Likewise, he had been horrified by the Elven War, not to mention how the elves were treated after the war. The notion of killing a Folkian of any race, be they Merfolkian, Elven, Fae, for nothing but a hunting trophy, made little sense to Jeremy and just seemed cruel. At least his fish fed the mouths of the Greens. At least they died for a purpose. And after hearing the angelic voices of the sirens, Jeremy was particularly distressed by the idea of the Greens catching one and preserving it. No, not it. Her. The poor lady would not only be paralyzed, but also jinxed in such a way that she would no longer need to breathe water or feed. She would then be forever frozen and left as an immortal statue for the land dwellers to ogle. Still perfectly conscious, but unable to move and speak. "We've been wanting to catch one, yes," said Audrey, "but I don't want to put Sir Jeremy's life at risk." She turned to Jeremy. "You do understand that they were trying to lure you to your death, right?" Jeremy nodded feebly, but to himself he thought, "Cosmos, in hindsight, it really is obvious that this is the case. But why do I so badly want to hear the singing again? I crave it like Raymond craves booze." King James sighed and said, I think we can put Sir Jeremy's life at risk if it means catching a mermaid. This is what noble mages like him should be doing anyway, risking his life for his territory, for the Greenlands, and for New-Camelot at large. Yet all he wants to do is spend his days at sea. The Greenlandian king almost spat at Jeremy as he said these last words. Audrey came to Jeremy's defense. But he brings us back delicious fish from the West Coast Sea. Jeremy knew that Audrey didn't really care about the fish. She just wanted Jeremy kept happy so that he would keep giving her affection behind closed doors. Still, he appreciated her effort. He knew King James had never approved of his duty as a fisherman, that he had felt it a waste of magical blood. And maybe it was, but Jeremy had never wanted to be of noble descent. He didn't fit in with the other upperclassmen, and was only selected as a noble and not forced to drain his powers into Emperor Sola's magical moat because his brother Sir Raymond was so close with King James, Emperor Sola, and the others. Much like how Marilyn Moss had been of noble descent only because she was Audrey's sister, and because King James loved Audrey so much. Or at least used to. And he provides you with other delicacies too, snarled King James. Maybe he does still love Audrey, Jeremy considered, because he's actually jealous of me, despite his own shenanigans in the capital. Jeremy was certain that King James would have ordered him to return to the sea at once, and that he would then follow closely behind in Ariana, harpoon at the ready. However, this was interrupted, for just then in came Princess Aurora and Prince Jonathan. Princess Aurora was the very image of her mother, for better and for worse. The little girl was a beautiful princess, but there was something else in her too. Something wild ran through her blood. King James really had tried, but to no avail. Ariana came through, even with how they had magicked away the visible traits, and particularly it came through in Princess Aurora's eyes, which were most stubbornly as green as the Greenlandian forest, just as Audrey's used to be. This was why Jeremy had such an affection for Audrey, because of what she truly was, unlike her husband, who seemed to want to mold her and everything around him to Emperor Sola's standards, despite clearly having an attraction to earthy ladies. Naturally, Princess Aurora and Prince Jonathan had got into a row, and somehow this was Princess Aurora's fault, as it always was. Jeremy felt for Princess Aurora. He saw how, like him, she was connected to the natural world, and privately he felt the Greenlandian princess would do much better if she was given a life similar to his own, one in which all that was expected of her was that she do mundane work in the natural world. But no, she had to marry the solar prince. Soon the king and the queen were getting up from their thrones and escorting their children back to their lesson chambers. On her way out, Audrey turned back to Jeremy and said, "You will not follow those voices again if you know what's best for you." Sir Jeremy nodded and answered, "Yes, my queen." The next day, Jeremy went fishing again, as he always did. He had decided that he would keep his promise to Audrey, that he wouldn't follow the voices. But at the same time, he couldn't help himself from wondering if he would ever hear their singing again. Was yesterday a once-in-a-lifetime experience? No, it wasn't, because almost immediately once he was in his rowboat, back on the West Coast waters, did he hear them? This time the sirens called even louder, desperately begging Jeremy to follow them. Drown, 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 a siren song spell carries you. Now, Jeremy had already decided not to follow them, but that decision was a bit like Raymond declaring that he was going sober and then walking straight into a tavern. Neither of the brothers could help themselves. He rowed out of the Greenlandian Bay, into the Big Blue, and then north, where the sirens were calling from. The waters were much rougher today, and the winds were blowing much harder. But had the weather conditions been like this when Jeremy was on the shore? No, they hadn't, otherwise he never would have left the bay. As he rowed closer to Green Island, the Merfolkian song grew louder and the sky turned darker, and sure enough, by the time he reached Green Island, he was in the midst of a thunderstorm. Both the wind and rain assaulted him from every direction, while lightning crackled and not long after, thunder boomed. Logically, he knew this was very dangerous, that he should turn back and row home at once. And yet, he simply could not bring himself to do that. He was starting to understand his brother now, why Raymond always failed to put down the bottle. So long as the sirens kept singing, Jeremy didn't care how stormy these waters got. There's no air below, little earth and no fire, the element of water. She conducts our choir. She gives her charm to the siren song spell, and she gives her power to the locket of Queen Ariel. That's a mother, the Merfolkian Queen. Her and King Poseidon, they rule all that lies under the sea. Both the wind and the waves rocked his boat from side to side. Raindrops fired at him like arrows. A thick mist engulfed him, clouding his ability to navigate the terrain. Yet all Jeremy could focus on were the beautiful voices. Just hearing them gave him more pleasure than all of Audrey's body ever could, and the Greenlandian queen was quite a skilled sorceress. Actually, once Jeremy had been given oil of poppy for a nasty flu he had caught while at sea, and this singing was even more pleasurable than that. He followed the siren song directly into a cove on the back of Green Island, hoping to catch sight of one of the singers. The waters became so rough that his boat was tossed up into the air in the same fashion the Greentown baker tossed his bread dough. Down, 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 a siren song takes you under the sea. Jeremy was still too mesmerized to worry about just how high up in the air his little rowboat went. He was still too high on the sound of the soft, feminine voices. They were singing directly to him, serenading him. On the way back down, the wind flipped his boat entirely. His body hit the water the way he had on occasion seen King James hit Audrey. Drown, drown, drown. You don't notice that you can't breathe. Jeremy was sinking, drowning. But did it really matter? Not so long as the sirens kept singing. Trapped in their hypnosis, he did not even attempt to swim away. Not that he would have been able to escape if he had tried. He just let the sirens, both their song and their undertow, take him. Down, 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 your soul will forever be lost at sea. Part 2. The Mermaid. Jeremy awoke to warm sand beneath him and bright sun on his face. He could still hear the voices. No, the voice. This time, only one. It took him a moment to fully comprehend what was in front of him. At first, he thought an ordinary red-headed maiden had somehow saved him from the storm. But would an ordinary maiden wear 2 purple starfish in the place of a bralette? Would she wear an amethyst-adorned spiral seashell tiara? And the voice, it was too beautiful. Sure enough, when Jeremy lifted his head up from the sand, he saw her purple tail spread along the shore. Am I in heaven? He wondered. But then he sprang up to his seat and dug his hands in the sand. No, I'm alive. The siren song spell had been broken, but how? This mermaid was still singing to him. Or at least she had been until he had sat up so abruptly. Now she had wriggled back an inch or two and was staring at him with concern in her sea-green eyes. Jeremy knew it was best to get back to the castle. Here he was, sitting at the beach with a mermaid beside him. And was this Rebel Beach? He supposed it had to be, because in the distance were the Greenlandian Isles. The Greens wouldn't like him here, in the place where the infamous rebel witch Selena and her loyal followers had lived for 3 suns, and even worse, next to a mermaid. He got to his feet and began backing away, slowly, cautiously, uncertain of what the siren might do. No, wait, she cried. Don't you want to know why you're not dead? Her speaking voice was just as lovely as her singing voice. Jeremy paused in his footsteps. He did want to know why he wasn't dead. Despite being afraid of the mermaid, he was intrigued. Go on, he agreed. My sisters, they tried to drown you, the mermaid admitted. Clearly. They got you hooked on their siren song. And you didn't? The mermaid shook her head. Why not? Jeremy questioned, unsure of whether or not he should trust this mermaid. She was a siren after all. Still, she had been singing when he woke up, yet the trance was broken, so clearly she hadn't been using the siren song spell like the others. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't bear to watch, let alone join them. She gave her head a shake. Yesterday, they got all the fish to swim out of the Greenlandian waters, luring you to row further out. Then they got you hooked. They were trying to drown you, but I bribed a shark to swim through the area they were working their siren magic in, and that scared them off, breaking the spell before they could drown you. This time, I waited until they had finished their magic, and then I swam in and carried your body to shore. Why would you not want to join them? Jeremy asked her. And why would they want to drown me anyway? But as soon as he asked the second question, intuitively, he seemed to already know its answer. His hunch was confirmed when the mermaid told him about how those who dwelled under the sea did not like those who dwelled on land. Even more so, the undersea dwellers loathed those who came from planet Earth, just as all races native to New-Camelot seemed to. And most of all, the Merfolkians despised land dwellers who fished. That was why my sisters came for you, the mermaid concluded. Jeremy stood there a moment, not speaking, just taking it all in. He had never acknowledged this, but the truth of the matter was that he didn't even like fishing. Of course, he had thought this was his passion, but it wasn't the act of catching fish that Jeremy loved. It was the sea herself. He had never really wanted to be a fisherman. It was a bit like if the Greens were to decide to make Princess Aurora a hunter, wasn't it? Jeremy had simply wanted to spend his days on the water, just as King James had accused him of in the throne room yesterday. Back on planet Earth, Jeremy's father had been a fisherman, as had his father's father and his father's father's father, and so on. It ran in his blood. He had a knack for it. This was why he had been able to reliably bring the Greens a fish. He seemed to understand the sea and all her wild ways. But ultimately, it had been a convenient excuse for living as though he himself was a merman. Earnestly, Jeremy said, "My apologies." When the mermaid raised her eyebrow, he said, "No, seriously, my apologies. It was wrong of me, especially considering how much I love the sea. I vow to never murder another undersea dweller again." But as soon as the words left Jeremy's lips, he didn't know if promising this was such a good idea. Surely Audrey would still expect his daily catch. "I know you love the sea," the mermaid said, smiling slightly. "I've been watching you, much longer than my sisters have. Most unfortunately, that was how they found out about you. The amount of fish you caught horrified them, and they felt it right to put an end to you. I, however, always saw you differently than my sisters. I could see the truth of who you are, even though they couldn't. Even though you couldn't." "How did you manage to save me?" Jeremy asked. "Once they had pulled you down into their undertow, they thought you were a goner. And you would have been, had I not been watching from a nearby grotto, waiting. They swam off laughing, and I swam over and carried you to shore. You were mere inches from death. You could only go a few more seconds without air. But I used my own siren song spell to keep you alive, and then revive you once you were back on land." Jeremy stared at the mermaid. Is this true? He wondered. And yet, when he searched his intuition, he knew it must be, for how else could he have survived? "I must get back to the Greenlandian castle," he said suddenly. For what would Audrey think of all this? Of him on Rebel Beach, conversing with a siren. And such a beautiful siren, too. The mermaid sighed. Well, if you must, but please, let me carry you there. I can get you back much more quickly. Jeremy took her up on the offer. If he were to walk, he wouldn't return to the Greenlandian castle until tomorrow at the earliest. And not only were his clothes still wet, but he had lost one of his boots. The mermaid wriggled back into the salty water and then instructed Jeremy to climb on her back. Jeremy did as he was told, climbing atop the siren's back as though she were a pony. It was a tad awkward, but she really was insistent that she get him back to Greentown safely. The mermaid could swim much faster than Jeremy could walk, or even row. In less than an hour, they were back at the place where the West Coast Sea became the Greenlandian Bay. I'll let you off here, the mermaid said. I trust that you can swim across the bay, and I don't want to risk one of the other land dwellers seeing me. Jeremy, too, thought this was a wise decision, and he slid off her back into the cool ocean water. When the mermaid turned to leave, however, he cried out, No! Wait! She turned back to him, raising an eyebrow. I didn't get your name. My name? Yes, your name. I mean, you did save me. I'd like to at least know your name. Artemis, she answered quietly, and then she turned to leave again. Jeremy couldn't help himself. Will I ever see you again? The mermaid turned back once more. If you wish to see me again, come down to the sea when the moon is in the sky. Sing my siren song to the mother herself, and I will appear. And then, almost as though she was never really there to begin with, she was gone. She dived down into the sea, disappearing in her depth. The mother, Jeremy thought to himself. The mother moon. This was language he dare not speak in front of the Greens or anyone else in Greentown, just as he had never publicly referred to the sea as she and her, only privately to himself. But he had a means of meeting with the mermaid, of meeting with Artemis, and for that, he was grateful. Jeremy stayed true to his word. He did not fish. Unfortunately, something about entering the throne room empty-handed for the second day in a row, not to mention his sopping wet clothes and missing boot, caused Audrey to lose faith in him, and she forbade him from ever again setting out to sea. Really, it was that she had lost trust in him, for the Greenlandian queen seemed to feel as though he had been unfaithful to her. His claim that there had been a raging storm did little for his case, as the rest of the Greenlands had seen nothing but sun, what with midsummer having passed only a fortnight ago. Audrey had figured the worst, that Jeremy hadn't followed her commands, but that he had instead followed the siren's song, and of course this was true. She hadn't guessed that he had got familiar with one particular mermaid, and Jeremy hoped to keep it that way. Still, the Greenlandian queen, despite understanding how the siren song spell affects one's perception, suspected that there was something more going on than just magic. Because of this, not only had she forbidden him from fishing, but she had also stopped requesting that Sir Jeremy meet her privately. Jeremy had mixed feelings about the latter. He had had a fondness for Audrey for as long as he could remember. As a child, he had admired his older brother's friend, and as a young adult, he had admired the Greenlandian queen. When Audrey started meeting with him in secret, it was a lifelong dream come true. On the one hand, anyway. On the other hand, he also knew that Audrey didn't really love him, that she was using him to escape her toxic marriage. And through the years, their meetings had, for the both of them, become more about coping with loneliness than they were about passion. Somehow he felt more of a connection with Artemis than he did with the lady he had known so long. Maybe he had once felt connected with Audrey in this way, but now she was a different woman. Slowly but surely she had become more and more of what King James wanted her to be. That bastard had such a hold on her. Jeremy suspected that this was because of how Audrey's father had died, burnt at the stake in a warlock trial back in the old world. Jeremy also had mixed feelings about not being able to go fishing. Audrey forbidding it certainly made it easier for him to keep his promise to Artemis. And anyway, Jeremy no longer had any interest in catching fish. Truthfully, the thought of seeing yet another poor creature wriggling around on his hook disgusted him, and he felt guilty for the many, many times he had taken the life of an undersea dweller. But what he did miss about fishing was being out at sea, of course. And without his job as the Green's fisherman, he had been forced to work as a castle guard. He absolutely despised this, spending the best part of the summer in chainmail, standing around in the muggy castle. Worst of all was Audrey's threat. "If you go following these siren songs again, we will find the wretched water nymph, and we will catch her." This had alarmed Jeremy. "You mean you'd kill her?" Through gritted teeth, the Greenlandian queen gave her grim answer. "No, we won't kill her. We will preserve her. She will be paralyzed, frozen like a statue, but her consciousness will remain intact. We will magic her so that she no longer needs to breathe water or eat food to survive, and she will become immortal. We will place her at the bow of Ariana." Audrey's allegiance had changed. While she had once been willing to defend Jeremy's right to the sea, now she was quick to take it away, and she seemed a lot more keen about catching a mermaid ever since she suspected that Jeremy had an affection for one. How could she blame him, though? Audrey had kept him satisfied, but never fulfilled. Jeremy always knew that he would never call the Greenlandian queen his bride. But what about the purple-tailed mermaid? If Jeremy contacted her, he would be putting Artemis's life at risk. If he was caught by the Greens, the siren would meet her demise, and it would be all his fault. So he had to keep away. However, as his days in chainmail dragged on and on, eventually, Jeremy realized that he had no choice but to see her. Artemis may not have been using a siren song spell on him, but the pull was just as strong. Part 3. The Witch. Artemis had mentioned the Mother Moon. While everyone in New-Camelot worshipped the sun, Jeremy knew of one Folkian who worshipped the moon, or at least he had heard of her. He had always wondered if she was just an urban legend, something the townsfolk told tales of just to frighten one another. It was rumored that there was an old hag named Zilla who lived in the Greenlandian forest just north of the Greenlandian Bay, not too far from Greentown. She had refused to drain her powers into Emperor Solo's magical moat, or so the folklore went. Now she lived in a rundown shack where she spent her days practicing the arcane arts. It was also rumored that desperate mundanes ventured to Zilla's shack, seeking solutions to their problems. Despite being a peasant, and despite the magical moat working against her, Zilla could work very powerful magic for a price. Of course, these were risky dealings, and the folklore warned against seeing Zilla. Sometimes people confuse Zilla with Zelina, but Jeremy knew they were not the same person. In his youth, back in the old world, both he and Zelina had attended magic lessons every night, until Zelina ran away, that was. But Jeremy did not remember a student named Zilla. The day before the full thunder moon, both Jeremy's frustrations and his longings had grown strong enough, and he couldn't take it anymore. He wanted to meet with Artemis, but only under one condition. He didn't want to ask her to rise to the surface and come to the shore. No, the only way he could meet with Artemis was if he himself became a merman. And the only way he could become a merman was through the use of magic. However, his own powers as a mage would not be strong enough for such a transformation. Jeremy was not a skilled mage. He had neglected the craft, but even if he had been skilled, nobles were not allowed to use magic self-righteously, and the magical moat would work against him. No, attempting such a complicated spell himself would be far too risky. Instead, Jeremy was going to have to do what Zelina had done back in old Camelot and go see the witch in the woods. But would Zilla be as powerful as Morgan Le Fay? Or would the magical moat work against her, too? Of course, Zilla should not have been using magic at all. Her crime was far worse than it would have been for Jeremy to attempt such a spell, and associating with her was a crime in and of itself. However, due to his noble blood, Jeremy couldn't be sent to Suicide Island. Still, if he was caught, he would be severely punished. But what choice did Jeremy have? He was desperate to see Artemis again. After the working day was over, Jeremy denied the invitations from his fellows to go out to Green Tavern for mead. Instead, he returned to his chamber to remove his chainmail and change back into his usual tunic. Much better, he thought, and he wondered about what he would wear as a merman. Nothing, I suppose. But what color will my tail be? He hoped for a blue as deep as the sea herself. Jeremy took one last look at his chamber. For a moment he wondered if he was making a mistake, giving all this up. But then he took his leave, and all the while he prayed that he would never see Greentown again. He made his way out of the castle, casually, as though he was going to join his fellows. In the market square, Jeremy was stopped by one of his colleagues. It was Sir Curtis, and he was the most obedient member of their watch. "Where are you going, Sir Jeremy?" Sir Curtis asked, stepping straight into Jeremy's path. Sir Curtis was also incredibly nosy. "To Green Tavern, for mead with my fellows," Jeremy lied. Sir Curtis didn't drink, so surely this was a safe story. Sir Curtis cocked his head sideways, narrowing his eyes and tightening his lips. "Really?" "Really," Jeremy concluded, and he stepped around Sir Curtis, leaving him in the market square. Of course, Jeremy did not find his seat at Green Tavern. All the same, he couldn't exactly walk across the castle's drawbridge, for where was he going with the sun so low in the Greenlandian sky? Instead, he made his way down a lonely alley, and he did what it was rumored that the little Princess Aurora did. He climbed the stone wall and, once at the top, jumped down into the moat. He swam across. The water was murky and unpleasantly warm, but indeed, this was better than being questioned by the Solar Allegiance or worse, Audrey herself. Once out of Greentown, Jeremy snuck behind the castle on the side that bordered the tangle-knot jungle. He stared at the forest of trees, somehow thicker than even the Greenlandian forest. Fortunately, no one really came south of Greentown, precisely because everyone was so afraid of Tangleknot. He snuck across the West Coast Road, again easy to do on this side of the castle, and he found himself on the West Coast Trail. He figured it was safe enough to walk up the trail, so he headed north towards the bit of forest where it was rumored that this hag's cabin was. As he moved up the trail, the sun fell lower and lower until eventually it was tucked behind the trees. The midsummer sky had been a bright blue, and then it had been pink and orange, and now it was a deep, vibrant blue. Its depth reminded Jeremy of the sea and how he wanted to call her waters home. And its vibrance served as a reminder of the magic he was about to ask for, and just how powerful that magic would have to be. It wasn't long before the sky was black, and even with the moon being almost full, Jeremy was struggling to stay on the trail. He paused in his tracks and prodded at his tunic. "Oh, curses of the underworld!" he cried. "How could I forget my wand? I must have left it in my suit of armor." But he was not surprised by this. Because he was so disinterested in magic, Jeremy often forgot his wand. "Cosmos, without my wand, how am I to see?" He asked no one in particular. For some reason, speaking aloud made him feel a bit better about being all alone in the dark woods. "I suppose I will have to head down to the beach and find a piece of driftwood to use as a torch." Jeremy was just turning towards the call of the ocean waves when he heard a rustling in the bushes. It wasn't the first time he had sensed that someone or something was behind him. They hadn't shown themselves, though, so Jeremy had dismissed his worries. Now that it was dark, however, he was much more spooked. Then came a raspy voice. "There is no need." Jeremy whipped back around. Hovering in the darkness, close to the ground, were two yellow eyes, and they were fixed on Jeremy. Jeremy stumbled backwards, tripping over a log and falling to his backside. "Who or what are you?" The yellow eyes inched closer to Jeremy, slowly but definitely. "I am the old forest hag's familiar. You seek her out because you wish to be transformed from a human into a merman." Jeremy nodded. The eyes shut themselves. They stayed that way for a moment, but then opened again, casting a glowing yellow light in front of them, like that of a firefly. In the glow, Jeremy could see the body attached to the yellow eyes. It was a cat. A black cat. "I can take you there," the familiar said confidently, and he turned and began walking away, straying from the trail. Jeremy hesitated only a moment. Then, before the light of the cat's eyes got too distant and dim, he pulled himself up and ran after the cat. The cat led him further and further away from the trail, deeper and deeper into the woods. Without the cat, Jeremy would have been completely lost. He was very frightened. But just as he was wondering if the cat had dragged him straight into the underworld, only then did the tiny little shack reveal itself. There must have been only one room inside, but indeed someone lived there, for smoke was rising from the chimney. The walls of the shack were made of wood, and the roof was thatched with straw. The cat let his eyes return to their mundane state, for it was brighter here. A cobblestone pathway swirled up to the little rounded door, and all the way up the pathway was lined with wooden staves. On the top of each staff was a skull, a Folkian skull, and their eyes glowed just like the cat's eyes had. Were these, as the folklore claimed, the skulls of the Folkians who had failed to live up to their end of the deal? Jeremy prayed to the cosmos that they weren't, that it had all just been a rumor. The cat meowed sweetly at the rounded door. From inside, a deep, croaky voice could be heard. "Oh, do come in, Sir Jeremy." Perhaps it would have been wise to turn around and run back home, spend the rest of his life in chainmail. But partially because Jeremy had such an affection for both Artemis and the sea, and partially because in the dark he wouldn't have been able to find his way home even if he had tried, he did, in the end, enter the old, run-down shack. Once inside, he saw the figure of a crone, short and stout. Zillah wore all black, a snugly tied shawl, a long flowing skirt, and tall lace-up boots. Atop her head sat a pointy black hat with a wide brim, just like the witches of old Camelot. She was stirring her cauldron, her back turned to Jeremy. The cat leapt up on the table beside the cauldron, purring and meowing and demanding attention.
"Why, yes. Thank you, my sweets," the hag cooed. "You helped Sir Jeremy find his way to our home, safe and sound."
How she knew his name and title, Jeremy did not know. He was rather frightened, and he wondered if he should have come here at all.
"Now, let's get down to business,"
Zillah said, as she turned around, finally revealing her face to Jeremy. Zillah looked like how the mundanes in old Camelot thought witches looked. She had a long, pointy nose, and her face was packed with lines. She looked like Zelena had after she returned from Morgan Le Fay's woodland lair, old, weathered, and wizened. How old Zillah actually was, Jeremy did not know, of course. Taking note of the moon-shaped pendant around the hag's neck, he knew that she must have been working with the underworld, and using that kind of magic aged you rapidly. The witch smiled devilishly at Jeremy as she continued,
"Now, you want to become a merman."
Jeremy nodded. Spooky as her already knowing all this was, he was relieved to not have to explain himself.
"And you want to become a merman because you love Princess Artemis."
Jeremy nodded, but then said, "Wait, Princess?"
"Yes, she is the daughter of King Poseidon, ruler of the Merfolkian kingdom, and all that lies under the sea."
"Is she? She never told me that."
Of course. You didn't know."
Zillah spoke in a soothing voice, but Jeremy wasn't soothed at all.
"Now, I can cast a spell that will turn you into a merman, but here's the catch. It will only last for 3 days.
3 days? But that's not—"
"Shush!" The hag hushed him. "Listen. On its own, the spell will only last for 3 days. However, if you can follow my simple instructions, The spell will become a permanent one, and you will remain a merman forever.
Well, what are the instructions? What do I have to do? Jeremy asked. Anything to be with Artemis again. Princess Artemis.
First, you have to get Princess Artemis to fall in love with you, the hag stated,
as though this was an act as mundane as baking bread or doing the washing, and not something depending upon the will of the cosmos itself.
Worry not, Sir Jeremy, worry not,
Zillah assured him, as though she could read Jeremy's fears.
My crystal ball tells me that Princess Artemis hasn't stopped daydreaming about you since she left you in the Greenlandian Bay, just as her siren song hasn't stopped sounding in your head.
Jeremy laid his eyes on the large sphere of smoky quartz perched behind where the cat was sitting on the table.
I am certain that she's already in love with you, so do not worry about that. Here's the tricky thing. I need you to fetch me the seashell locket that her mother, Queen Ariel, wears around her neck.
Both Zillah's eyes and smile widened manically as she gave this order. You mean you want me to steal it?
Sure. It need not matter how you get it, just get it. And I need you to marry Princess Artemis before the moon rises on the third day.
Jeremy tried to imagine exactly when the moon would rise on the third day. It would be just a few nights after tomorrow's full moon, so it would rise shortly after sunset, during twilight. But how can I steal something from her family while also joining her family? Jeremy questioned.
That's a problem for you to solve, the hag told him. Wed Artemis, bring me the necklace, and you shall forever swim in the sea with your love.
And what happens if I fail? Jeremy asked, voice quivering. The hag's smile grew as wide as her face, showcasing her rotten teeth. Her eyes lit up like the skulls in her garden.
Fail, and your body will turn to sand on the beach, and your soul will be mine.
Zillah gestured towards yet another skull, this one sitting on her shelf. It looked as though it had once belonged to a high elf, judging by the ear bones. A shiver ran down Jeremy's spine. If he failed, his fate would be that of this elf's.
Do we have a deal?
The hag asked, extending a scroll and a quill towards Jeremy. Jeremy didn't even let himself mull it over, for he knew if he did, it would be so much harder to sign. Instead, he put on a tough face and marched over to the hag. He took the scroll and quill from her, then sat down at a little table on the other side of the shack and signed Sir Jeremy Jonah at the bottom. Then the hag cackled horribly as she tossed all kinds of ingredients into the cauldron. She must have known I was going to sign, Jeremy thought to himself as she worked, because she already started brewing the potion before I got here. The cauldron bubbled. Smoke of green and blue rose from it. The witch hummed merrily as she worked, but she had this devious look in her eyes that made Jeremy feel uneasy. Eventually she said,
"All right, the potion is complete."
And she selected one of the many glass bottles from her cupboard. Jeremy observed how much potion was left in the cauldron and wondered if he could ask for an extension should he run out of time. But then he thought better of this. He had signed the document. He needed to both marry Artemis and retrieve her mother's locket for the witch.
"Now, do you know what day tomorrow is?"
Zillah asked him. The full thunder moon? Jeremy answered.
Right you are. Tomorrow night you are to head down to the sea and drink the potion. Then you will have 3 days to marry Artemis and bring me the seashell locket. I will be waiting for you at Rebel Beach on the 3rd eve of the waning gibbous moon.
Zillah allowed Jeremy to rest in her cabin through the darkness of the night. For this, Jeremy was appreciative, although he didn't sleep a wink. When the sun began to rise, Zillah told Jeremy he had to leave, so he took his potion, thanked the witch, and exited the shack. On his way out, she called behind him,
Remember, should you fail, your body will be turned to sand, and your soul will be mine.
Her words echoed in his head as he walked down the pathway adorned with skulls. The eyes still glowed, but only faintly, what with dawn's light creeping in through the trees. Jeremy tucked the potion safely away in his tunic and practically ran back to Greentown. Still, he took the same West Coast trail rather than taking Green Road, which journeyed through the forest. He did this to keep himself reminded of why he was going to all this trouble. For his love of Artemis, for his love of the sea. Jeremy worked one final day as a castle guard. Then, once the sun had set, he made his way out to the most northern point of the Greenlandian Bay, and he sang Artemis's song to, as she had called it, the Mother Moon. Oh, sailor, listen to my song. Let my voice guide you. I'm sorry my sisters did you wrong. You love the sea, and I would love to take you down, down, down into the big blue, but you would drown, drown, drown. So to the shore I carry you. Jeremy didn't really know if he believed the moon was the mother, just as the sun was the father. It felt like old world magic. But maybe it was the truth, for not long after he started singing was he joined by another voice, a beautiful voice. Artemis's ginger head poked out of the water. Jeremy, I was waiting for you. I wasn't sure if you were ever going to call for me. I didn't feel it right to meet with you if it meant risking your life, and so long as I am a land dweller, I would be. Jeremy then explained how the king and the queen wanted to catch and preserve her. That's vile, Artemis cried. But I know not all land dwellers are this way. The low elves have never done such things to us merfolkians, and surely you would never hurt me. No, I would never dream of doing such a thing, Jeremy assured her. That is why I went and got this. He retrieved the potion from his tunic and explained what the witch in the woods had promised him. Artemis stared wide-eyed at Jeremy. You would become a merman? For me? For you, and for my love of the sea. And he told her about the deal he had made with Zillah, although he admitted the part about the seashell locket. It was not long before Jeremy was drinking the potion. It tasted of salt water, but he managed it down. Just a moment later, there was a tingling sensation in both his legs and throat. When he tried to draw his next breath, he was filled with the urge to dive into the water, so he did. And just in time, too, for when his body met the sea, he no longer had legs, but fins. a deep blue Merfolkian tale. "'Twas a dream come true. Now Jeremy got to explore the wonderful world he had merely been able to float atop of before. Artemis led him north, towards and behind the Greenlandian Isles, out into the big blue. Then down, 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 first past a world of color, coral reefs, and schools of fish, but then deep down into the depths of the sea, into a world of black. It was dark, darker than the nighttime Greenlandian forest, in fact. Without Artemis singing to him, this terrain would have been impossible to navigate. Just as Jeremy was wondering if he was being taken straight into the underworld, the Merfolkian kingdom revealed itself. The castle was made of coral, and its towers were crowned with spires of spiral seashells fit for giants. Artemis led him inside, where both her parents were perched on their thrones. "King Poseidon and Queen Ariel," Jeremy feared. "What if they see that I am not a real merman?" However, when Artemis introduced Jeremy to her parents, they were delighted for their happiness. "This is wonderful," Queen Ariel cried, and King Poseidon agreed. "Yes, indeed. Now what did I say? I said stop swimming to the surface and admiring the Greenlands, and instead explore the undersea world, and you will find a suitable merman, and you did." Truth be told, the Merfolkian king and queen were growing old, and they had been wanting their eldest daughter to get married, so she and her beloved could take over for them. Artemis's sisters, however, while they feigned happiness, they seemed suspicious. The youngest, who had coral pink fins and was named after her mother, said, "Doesn't he look a little familiar, girls?" Fortunately, the Merfolkian king and queen were both so relieved that Artemis had found a suitor that they didn't give this comment any thought. By Artemis's request, the Fisherman and the Mermaid were to be wed in 3 days' time. Jeremy had never known a happiness like the one he experienced in those 3 days, swimming through the big blue, admiring the coral reefs, exploring the caverns and grottos. It was unfortunate that it could not last. Jeremy had considered asking Artemis to steal the locket so he could give it to Zilla, but in the end he decided against it. Although he still didn't completely understand just what this locket did, he did understand its significance. The thing was an ancient relic passed down from generation to generation, and it would be passed down to Artemis. When Jeremy had learned that Artemis would wear the locket at their wedding, a Merfolkian custom, he understood this to be his chance. On the 3rd day, while Artemis was busy with wedding preparations, Jeremy snuck into her chamber and retrieved the locket from her vanity, where it lay beside her other wedding attire, a bralette and a crown, both made of white seashells and adorned with pearls. He stuffed the locket inside the satchel the two of them had been using to gather precious stones, undersea treasure. Now all he had to do was get the locket to Zilla before moonrise. The party was likely to go on well into the night, however, and he wasn't sure how he would escape his own wedding. What proved to be a bigger problem was this. Just before the ceremony, when Artemis went to get dressed, it wasn't long before she returned to the throne room, panicked and flustered. "Mother and Father! The seashell locket! It's gone!" Alarmed, King Poseidon bellowed, "Every available merman mustn't rest until the locket is found." "But, Father," Princess Ariel started, in a nasty, proud tone, "what if the locket
isn't far from home? What if it's just inside Jeremy's satchel?
Both the Merfolkian king and queen gave their youngest daughter a curious look. Artemis gave her head a shake, as though this couldn't possibly be true.
I say this, Princess Ariel continued, because he really does look like the fisherman who we were trying to drown. The fisherman who Artemis was so infatuated with.
Artemis looked as though she could have murdered Princess Ariel. Queen Ariel stared at Jeremy, head extending outward and eyes narrowing.
Curses of the underworld! He is a land dweller! He must have the locket!
And he's not just a land dweller, but an earthling, King Poseidon added. Seize him! At once, the Merfolkian guards launched towards Jeremy. Jeremy bolted out of the castle. The sirens sang to him.
Oh, sailor, come listen to our song.
Jeremy, however, had the body of a merman, and therefore their song had no effect on him. He kicked his fins with all his might, up, up, up. Once he reached the surface, he swam towards the shore, towards Rebel Beach. He still had the locket after all, and was that not truly what the hag wanted? Would she really care that his wedding plans hadn't come to fruition? Perhaps he could still meet with Zilla, and in exchange for the locket, she could turn him back into a land dweller. Oh, but then I will never see Princess Artemis again, Jeremy fretted. All the same, do I deserve her after what I've done? Jeremy did not let his thoughts prevent him from swimming ahead of the merfolk and making it to Rebel Beach. When he rose to the surface, the slightest piece of glowing copper was poking out from behind the west coast waves. He still had time. And sure enough, in the velvety, deep blue twilight, Jeremy could see the silhouette of the tall, pointy hat.
You've made it, Zilla cackled. But where is your true love?
Please, Jeremy cried, propping himself up onto the shore and throwing the satchel down on the sand. I've brought you the locket. I've brought you the thing you truly wanted. Please turn me back into a land dweller. Despite Jeremy's pleas, the hag would do no such thing. Triumphantly, she shook her head and cried,
No, for this way I get to keep both the locket and your soul. And in truth, I wanted both things.
Jeremy never got the chance to argue Zilla further, for just then, from the nearby trees, someone shouted, Seize the hag! In came the Solar Allegiance. Somehow, they must have known that Zilla would be here at Rebel Beach. Jeremy then recognized one of the men. Curtis! So that was why Jeremy had heard the rustling in the bushes on his way to see Zilla. It hadn't been the cat after all. Sir Curtis must have followed Jeremy to the hag's hut, listened to what the hag had told him, and then reported back to the Solar Allegiance. As the Solar Knights used magic to bind Zilla, Sir Curtis looked down at the shoreline, and his eyes became very large and round, much like what was on the horizon.
Sir Jeremy? Sir Curtis gasped. What have you done to yourself? What has this rebel witch done to you?
But it wasn't the Solar Allegiance and his punishment in their world that Jeremy had to be afraid of. In fact, that might have been the better fate. Jeremy glanced up at the sky, and Zilla gave her horrible cackle. The big copper moon was now above the waves. Although Zillah was captured and would soon be facing her own fate worse than death, the hag enjoyed every second of what played out before her. First, Jeremy turned back into a land dweller, his fins morphed into legs, and then, just as Zillah had promised, grain by grain, his body turned to sand. The curse was slow and beautiful. Zillah may have been on her way to Suicide Island, but Jeremy's soul would forever belong to her. Sure, the Solar Allegiance might raid her lair, but the Fisherman's consciousness would be trapped in one of her many skulls, the high elven skull that she had so carefully selected. This seems like the end of the story, but it isn't. For whatever became of Princess Artemis and the seashell locket? Like the other Merfolkians, Artemis had swum after Jeremy, although not for the same reasons. Even though Jeremy had stolen not just her family's but her kingdom's most precious belonging, Artemis still loved him. She wanted to find him and ask him why he would do such a thing. However, when Artemis got to Rebel Beach, in the moon's light, all she found was the satchel lying in the sand. Inside, of course, was the seashell locket.
Jeremy? Jeremy?
She called. She sang for him, too.
Oh, sailor, listen to my song. Let my voice guide you. I'm sorry my sisters did you wrong.
But it was all in vain. Artemis clutched the locket in her hands and began to cry.
Oh, where is Jeremy?
She wondered.
If I hadn't found the locket, I might have assumed that he ran off with it. But because it was laying here on the shore, and because Jeremy's nowhere to be seen, something terrible must have happened to him.
When her parents emerged at the surface of the sea in the distance, Artemis turned and threw the locket back to them. Queen Ariel caught the locket and hung it safely around her neck. Just a moment later, the faces of both King Poseidon and Queen Ariel fell. Coming from the south was the infamous Ariana. At once, the Merfolkian king and queen called desperately to their daughter, imploring her to dive underwater. But they were too late. The Greens had already aimed their harpoon, and in one quick fire, Artemis was hooked. By her purple fins, she was dragged through the water, directly into the Greens' clutches. Right there on Ariana did the Greens use magic to preserve her, turning her into a living statue. However, Artemis was never forced to leave the sea. Instead, they used her to adorn the bow of their ship. From that night on, everyone the Greens brought onto Ariana complimented their decoration.
She's so beautiful and so lifelike.
Thank you for tuning into the Tales of the Sun and the Moon. To share this work with you is truly an honor. If you enjoyed today's story, click the link in the show notes to order your copy of Aurora and Luna. The wondrous world of New-Camelot will always be waiting for you. Until next time, stay cozy.